Good day and welcome to Your Voice. I'm Jim Ranney and I'm here with Senator Patrick Gallivan of the 59th Senate District. Senator Gallivan, welcome.
Glad to be here, Jim.
Just recently wrapped up the legislative session. In a word or two, how would you describe this legislative session?
I think it was very successful. We went through the last 6 months, enacted a very responsible budget, increasing aid to education, transportation, agriculture, things of that nature. And as we approached the end of the session, we touched on a couple things I think very important to different segments of the state's population, namely senior citizens and their financial exploitation. We began to take steps to try to correct that. And then we look at this terrible scourge and epidemic across the state with heroin addiction. And we took significant steps to try to do something about that in a combination of treatment, enforcement, and education. So I'm encouraged. We have a lot of work to do, but I'm encouraged by this session. I think it was positive overall.
We'll get to some of those points in detail in just a moment, but let's start with the budget. The fourth consecutive on-time budget. How significant is that for the state of New York?
Well, when we look at what New York has become known as, and we look back to 2009, 2010, which kind of led to my impetus in running for the Senate, we saw record late budgets. I think it was 30, 40 years of late budgets. Very irresponsible spending, increased growth in the spending of taxpayer monies by the state legislature. And what we've seen now the last 4 years is 4 on-time budgets. We've continued to work in a bipartisan manner each of the 4 years. We have a self-imposed spending cap that we have stayed under, consistent with the property tax cap that we have imposed on local governments and school districts across the state. And I think it's in stark contrast to what New York State was in years past, and in stark contrast to the dysfunction and standstill that we see in Washington.
In that budget, education funding was key, $1 billion extra in state education funding. Why did you feel, and obviously your colleagues agreed, that education funding needed to be increased to a tune of $1 billion?
We go back to 2009, 2010. There was the institution of what was called the gap elimination adjustment to make up for the significant gap in New York State budget, hence the means to eliminate it. And it terribly cut into education funding and really handicapped our schools across the state, not just the urban schools, but the rural schools across the state, which are symbolic of the schools that I largely represent in southern Erie County, Wyoming, Livingston, and southern Monroe County. But nonetheless, we have worked to try to eliminate that gap, that so-called gap, the gap elimination adjustment, and restore funding to schools. And the last 2 years, we've done, I believe, a very good job in restoring funding to schools. Problem is, our kids haven't been able to compete. They're falling further and further behind, in some cases other states, and in certain cases other countries. We need to fund the schools properly. I don't think throwing money at the problem is the answer. We spend over $20 billion. But by our restoring the funding and working to eliminate the gap, I think we properly fund the schools, and now we have to go a step further, working towards making sure that there was an equitable and fair distribution of that funding statewide.
Another part of that budget in terms of education was funding for the school resource officer, a program that I know is important to you. Explain what that program is and the idea of having a school resource officer available in districts that want it.
If we go back to the 90s, and we saw a spate of problems in schools across the country. Columbine is one that comes to people's mind. I think that was in 1999. In any event, at that point in time, one of the answers was try to introduce police officers into schools, not just to provide security, but to serve as a mentor, to help teach, to help educate, to help head off problems, essentially to be the community police officer, the cop on the beat in a school where it's a community of our children. People that obviously anybody who is a parent doesn't recognize anything is more valuable than that or more dear to them than that. We saw initial federal funding for that. The federal funding went away, and the program lapsed in many places in New York State and across the country. With the shootings in Sandy Hook, we saw a renewed outcry for safety in our schools, security in our schools. And I, with my background in law enforcement, I've always been an advocate of a school resource program, a school resource officer. And fortunately, we were able to secure some funding in this year's budget to allow schools to access the funding, share school resource officers, and then we can see the positive things that the police officers do in schools in interacting with the kids, heading off problems, dealing with bullying, dealing with drug abuse, with alcohol abuse. And then on top of it, the positive bonus, if you will, is that they get to work with school administrators in implementing emergency plans and working to keep their school safe.
And the notion here is that districts would work together. They'd share an officer.
Unfortunately, we were not able to secure enough funding in the state to provide a school resource officer for every single school on a full-time basis. But last year, we were able to put together a grant program in our district where a number of schools shared a school resource officer. It put a lot on the shoulders of one police officer, in this case, an Erie County Deputy Sheriff. And we worked to change the program a little bit to not have much of a burden on their shoulders. But by sharing an officer and being able to provide funding for that from the state level, at least we can encourage schools to take the steps that they need to keep their schools safe, to help prevent the problems, bullying, drug abuse, things of that nature, and try to encourage them to share an officer, kind of like we see the cry from taxpayers. Merge things where you can, share resources where you can. Unfortunately, not enough money to provide an officer for every single school, but we have funding in place that people can at least share the resource, and I think we see a positive benefit out of that.
Another initiative in that budget is crossbows, something that seems to be very popular, certainly in your district, the 59th Senate District, but no doubt in communities across the state where hunting is popular. Explain this program.
We worked very hard on that. Beginning 3 or 4 years ago, the notion of crossbow hunting in New York State being illegal or very limited was brought to my attention. And of course, our district, very rural, a lot of sportsmen, a significant amount of sportsmen and women in our district and naturally across the state. They inquired about the idea of making the use of a crossbow legal in all hunting seasons. So I began to look into it, and I saw that the DEC called for its use in their 5-year deer management plan. And we looked at the research, we looked at the other states that implemented this or allowed its use, and in each and every case, they were better able to manage their deer population. We saw that it was very safe, and we saw increase in revenues and licenses and tourism and things of that nature. We canvassed people. We held forums. We held hearings in many areas of the state. We held a hearing here in Albany, and we worked extremely hard. We were not able to get it passed in each of the last 2 years, but I am thrilled. After much hard work by many people, we were able to get crossbow hunting approved in this year's budget. We anticipate at least a 15% increase in archery license, which will add at least $1 million to the general fund of the state. More people will be able to hunt, the elderly, the disabled. Oftentimes, women do not have the upper body strength, and these are the people that kept coming forward. And when you combined all the people that supported it, it was in excess of 90% of sportsmen and women across the state that supported it. Very popular, I think a very responsible and good thing that the state this year has done for sportsmen.
One last thing on the budget, agriculture. Another industry that's huge, not only in your district, but across much of upstate New York. There's a lot of things in this budget to support agriculture and the growth of agriculture.
It is. Agriculture is New York's #1 industry. And it's been frustrating to me that we don't respect it enough in the budget to the point that we spend less than 0.5% on agriculture in the state budget, an $140 billion budget. We've been able to hold the line on to ensure that the funding hasn't been decreased over the last 4 years. And this year we were able to provide for a slight increase, and I'm encouraged by that. We introduced the Young Farmers Program to encourage younger people to stay involved in agriculture so that they can more easily take over the family farm. We've tried to reform the estate tax, some loan forgiveness programs, funding for future farmers of America. And in our district, Wyoming County, little Wyoming County with 40,000 people, is #1 in New York State in the output in the dairy industry. We were able to provide some funding, some seed money for an agriculture and business center that we're hoping will do to Wyoming County what the nanotechnology business did to Albany. It's ideally located in the center of Western New York, in the center of agriculture country. It'll support the yogurt industry and other things that are going on in Batavia and the other counties around Wyoming County, so I'm very excited about that.
A couple of other things legislatively that happened this session that you touched on earlier. One was the package of bills dealing with the epidemic of heroin. We've seen it across New York State in all communities, and action has been taken. The governor has signed into law new restrictions. You're a former member of law enforcement, former sheriff, former state trooper. Explain the importance of this package of bills.
We look back in time and we see in the 80s, we saw the increase in crack cocaine use and the problems in our inner cities. And we then saw the lawmakers, law enforcers, educators try to do something about it, and they were somewhat successful, and we've seen different patterns over the years. The past several years, the legislature looked very hard at prescription drug abuse and did something about it through the I-STOP legislation, very comprehensive legislation to tackle this problem of prescription drug abuse, the abusers, the doctors who were overprescribing, and we put in legislation that was very, very successful to the point that we made great gains in preventing that prescription drug abuse or reducing the incidence of that. But what it led to was people out on the streets looking to replace that. Those that were addicted to the opioids replaced it with heroin, where it was much cheaper, easier to get, and as compared to the way it was years ago, it's much more potent, much more pure, much more dangerous, highly addictive, and we see our kids and young adults dying across the state. In a year or two, it reached epidemic proportions. So to the credit of everybody in the legislature, the governor's office as well, we worked very hard in a bipartisan manner to tackle this in a three-pronged approach: enforcement, education, and prevention. The only way that it works is if you're trying to do it from at a multifaceted level. You can't do just one of them. So I'm encouraged. The governor signed the legislation immediately after the Senate had held hearings across the state, a series of 18 hearings. I was part of the task force that did that, issued a report, and called for this multi-pronged approach. And in very short order, the legislature and the governor responded in what I think is a very positive way that no doubt will save lives, save the lives of our young people, and hopefully put an end to this epidemic.
We've only got about a minute left, but I know there's been some legislation that wasn't successful this past session that is still important to you that you'd like to see move forward. So let's talk quickly, if we can, about a couple of bills that I know that you want to see advanced. And one of them, of course, the women's equality agenda in the Senate and elder abuse.
When we see in various workplaces across the state that women in this day and age do not receive equal pay, that they continue to be harassed, we continue to have problems with domestic violence, I think we have an obligation to do something about it. For 2 years in a row, the Senate has passed legislation to deal with it, the Senate's Women's Equality Agenda. The Assembly has refused to do so. We have to continue to work to make that a reality, to ensure that women are indeed treated equally and that we can reduce or eliminate, which should be our goal, the harassment, the domestic violence. The financial exploitation of the elderly as our population continues to age, baby boomers continue to age, we see more and more of that, the financial exploitation of the elderly as a problem. We did a little bit this session. We have a long way to go. Hopefully that's something we can accomplish next session.
And we'll keep you updated and find out more as we go forward on the updates from you as terms of where this legislation goes in the future. Senator, thanks for your time.
It's my pleasure, Jim. I continue to be honored to serve the citizens of the 59th District.